I'm speaking in good faith today with some really great folks from New Hampshire who are part of the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry. And I ran into Reverend Mark Koyama in Chicago at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and I was so struck by the visual impact of the quilts we are going to talk about that I had to go over and ask about what was happening. And then I knew that I needed to invite Mark, and then he suggested others who were part of the project to be here today. So thank you to all of you for being willing to speak with me.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Here's our cast of characters, and I have the feeling some of them really are characters. So we'll start with
What do you mean?
I'm talking to you, Harriet. I've heard you speak on video. So here are our characters today. Reverend Mark Koyama grew up in Southeast Asia and New Zealand before coming to live in the U.S. in 1980. He was educated at Bates College, Union Theological Seminary, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Yale Divinity School. He teaches literature and religious studies at Northfield Mount Hermon School and is the settled pastor at the United Church of Jaffrey in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Also with this is Kathy Barrett Blair. Kathy has a degree in occupational therapy from UNH and worked as the preschool occupational therapist for the Keene School District for 34 years. She chaired the Ukama Mission Group in partnership with UCC churches in Zimbabwe. Kathy designed and coordinated the renovation of UCC Keene's Elsie Priest Park and Children's Playground. She expresses her creativity through fabric, including the design and construction of quilt number 4 of the George Floyd quilts. Dr. Harriet Ward is a scientist and a Christian activist. Her doctorate from Brown University empowered her to serve infants and young children with vision loss, blindness, and additional health and developmental challenges. Called by Christ to anti-racism work, Harriet is a powerful voice in the United Church of Christ, where she served on the board of directors of the National United Church of Christ and is chair of the Anti-Racism Ministry Group, New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ. And listeners will have figured this out, I think, at this point, but UCC, that's United Church of Christ.
And could I add?
Please.
Could I add that I am also a quilter?
Yes. Very important
Okay.
and germane to the topic at hand. And I wonder, because I think this started with a seed that you planted, Reverend Mark Koyama, if you would tell me about how the George Floyd Quilt Project first sparked into your mind.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you very much for having us. It's a great honor to be here with you folks today. The narrative that I tell is that I was in my greenhouse working, planting some seeds on a spring morning in at the end of May of 2020. It was a week after George Floyd had been killed. And I received a text from one of my parishioners, and she asked me if I could help her to gather fabric so that she could make a Black Lives Matter banner that we could put on the front of the church. The church had been really activated by the murder of George Floyd and was interested in kind of coming out, so to speak, with their support of Black Lives Matter. But when she asked me that question, it spurred a kind of a chain reaction of thought process for me. I thought, well, the first thing I thought was, well, I have a number of people in my church who like to work with fabric. So this is not just something that this one person would be interested in. And then it occurred to me that, well, that's actually true of many churches. And then I, of course, thought of the AIDS quilt. So you can see how this kind of this cascade of ideas is developing right away. So immediately I had this kind of, it was kind of a thunderstruck moment when I realized the possibilities here. And then later that day, I received an email from a left-leaning group on the internet who was promoting police reform. And it being a week after George Floyd had been killed, they they included in the text of the email the final words that George Floyd had said as he was being pinned to the sidewalk there in Minneapolis. And I had this kind of almost out of body experience reading this 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 text, because it was laid out like a like a poem on the page, and as a poet I was reading it almost like a poem. And then as halfway through reading it, I realized that this was, the most kind of harrowing, terrifying poem one could ever read, because one never has the consciousness when one's reading a poem that the person who's writing it is in the process of essentially dying, and that
Yeah.
these words were his final plea that were not being listened to. So these two ideas came together in that moment for me, and I realized that this would be a powerful text that we could use for this notion of using quilting as a form of both of allyship and also of activism in this moment, in this kind of crucial moment. Um, and so I made a proposal to the anti-racism mission group, which is the ministries group, which is the part of uh, the New Hampshire United Church of Christ, and they endorsed the idea, and we then presented a proposal to all of the churches in New Hampshire, and 9 churches returned and were interested in taking part. So we broke those final words into 8 stanzas, essentially. And we had an introductory quilt which says George Floyd's last words, and a final quilt which says Black Lives Matter. And then the 8 quilts between the first and the 10th were the quilts that have the final
Uh-huh.
words broken into stanzas.
Harriet, I wonder, you mentioned yourself being a quilter as well
I am.
as Kathy. Tell me about when you first heard this idea and what went through your mind, what you felt.
Uh-oh. Well, I say uh-oh because I was on it was then called the Racial Justice Mission Group of the New Hampshire Conference. It has a new name, which is Anti-Racism Ministry Group, and I chair that. But at the time, I wasn't chair, but I was part of the group, and we received this idea from this Mark Koyama. I had never heard. Well, I had seen his name, but I didn't know who he was or anything about him, except that he was the guy that had covered the lawn of his church with a whole lot of crosses. Remember that, Mark?
Yeah. You knew about that?
That's all I knew about you. That you were the guy that did that. It's a little bit of a segue, but take 2 seconds to explain the crosses, because that had an impact on me.
The crosses, I did this what I called a prayer action, in which we put the number of crosses out on the lawn of the church for each person who had been killed by a mass shooting that year. So it was something on the order of 280 white crosses at the time of the prayer action.
So that's all I knew of Mark, was that he was the guy who had done that. But beyond that, I saw this proposal for all this quilt making, and I was skeptical. I'm within the conference, okay, it goes back to a comment I saw about the Great White North. There are not a lot of black people here. I don't see black people. I can walk around all day and never see another black person in Exeter, New Hampshire, or go to never. So I'm looking at this and thinking about how is this going to work? How is this going to be coordinated? I was just skeptical. But what I did was send this announcement to all of the churches, make sure that it got to all of the churches in our conference, 132 churches. And then later on, I also said, well, I'm a quilter. I'd like to do it too. In the church that I used to attend, I just said, I'll do this too. And there was a little brouhaha about that, but finally it was like, well, I'm black and I'm a quilter, so can I do it too? Because even in my church, I'm the only black person, and all of the white Christians said, we'll do this. And nobody thought to ask me if I wanted to do it too. So I crashed the party and stayed. And then in crashing the party, this George Floyd, what happened to George Floyd, hit me in a very different way than would hit any person who is not black. It would have to. And I just attribute it to, you might witness it, but I experience it.
Right.
And that's a little different. So I was experiencing it, and everybody else was witnessing it. And the twain were not meeting because we didn't exactly share a purpose. And I think you saw in the documentary where I complained about the racism I confronted just making a quilt in a sanctuary.
Yes.
So finally, I just
comments.
removed the quilt from the sanctuary and went home and finished it. So that was my sort of, and I have an aesthetic that's my own. And now I've learned a lot from Kathy that I can share and create something amazing, not just in something that you see, but in something I feel in the experience of quilt making, because I've changed after having made 2 quilts with Kathy. And I'd never in my life made a quilt with anyone except my grandmother, who was an old black lady, right? Which I am now. So this has been a transformative experience for me of, feeling that I needed to actually leave the church to finish my quilting. It was very painful. It was actually traumatic. To a place where all I can think about is, what quilt will I make with Kathy next time? So it's been a really good thing for me. And it has really solidified the ministry. I'm on a call. It's solidified the ministry for me because I have Mark and Kathy.
And
So that's my story.
And Dr. Harriet Ward, I wonder, could you tell me which of George Floyd's words were on the quilt you worked on?
Well, so this is interesting. Quilt 9, which was the one that had 1,380 squares that are sort of ombreed up,
Mm-hmm.
and it says, I can't breathe, in ragged ribbon. And in my church, they said, we want to do the quilt that says, I can't breathe, because it's just 3 words, and we'll be able to get it done fast. And I said, wait a minute. I can't breathe are the most important words, and my people, my ancestors, have been screaming those words for centuries. We've had the breath snuffed out of us in so many ways for centuries. Even growing up in a family that said, don't breathe, you'll get in trouble. Don't move, don't breathe. If you confront a white person and you're not sure what's going on, don't breathe. Just keep your mouth shut, don't breathe, you'll get in trouble. I can't breathe. I thought those were really important words. And the people who were going to sew them thought they were just 3 words, let's get them out of the way. That was one of my first conflicts. So I did I can't breathe. And those words to me mean everything.
It sounds like because the Anti-Racism Committee is part of your personal ministry, I'm just wondering what you felt spiritually, whether it's connection to God, to ancestors, or to the work you're doing while you were doing the quilting.
Well, I had some moments where I don't want to get too magical about it, but I know that I could feel the godness. When I was working in the sanctuary, it was COVID, so there was nobody there. And so I had this whole giant church space to work in, which was good because it meant my cats were home and not trashing everything I was trying to do. And I was literally building that quilt on a design board under a cross. And at one point, I kind of looked up, because I don't use patterns. The fabric will speak to you. There's all kinds of beautiful stuff in the fabric itself. And so I was letting the fabric almost decide where and how it wants to be. And as I was doing that, I looked up at what was growing, and there was a cross in the quilt. And it's barely visible, but it just grew. There's a cross in the quilt. The quilt starts in the bottom of the quilt. It's very dark. And then it goes into the light, just some Black liberation theology going into the light. And up just as you get into the light, there's a cross. And that really hit me. Mm. But it was also somewhat spiritually crushed because I couldn't get a connection with people about the racism and how much it hurts and how important it was to recognize it and sort of confess to it and work with it. I couldn't do that. And so it was kind of lonely spiritually because I was in a different place. I was in a place of an experience where others were in a place of witness. But going forward, when I work with Kathy, that went away. I feel spiritually lifted when I'm with Kathy and fabric.
Well, there's a great segue to ask Kathy first about her quilting instincts and what you thought when you first heard about the project.
Yes, thank you. I first heard about the project because my pastor, the Reverend Cynthia Bagley at the United Church of Christ in Keene, sent me forwarded to me the email that I assume Mark composed that talked about this vision of creating 10 quilts to memorialize the words of George Floyd or to witness to those words. And Pastor Bagley just wrote on the email that she forwarded, "This has your name written all over it." It was COVID. I wasn't seeing anyone from church in person. And she knew that I was a quilter because I had coordinated making a Habitat for Humanity partner family quilts. We would make a quilt and present them each time our church participated in a habitat build in our area. So she knew that I had done some quilting and had coordinated that sort of work. And I read the information and thought, yes, I do want to participate in this. And I think I may have been the first response back to Mark that I would like to be involved. And again, we were in COVID and our church was really in a very, very much of a lockdown kind of situation. And right. So the only thing that I thought was that I don't want to do this all alone, and maybe there's a way I can ask the youth in our church to participate. And they did participate, many of them, youth and their families, in cutting out the lettering of the words on the quilt that we did, and that was quilt number 4 in the series of 10. And
can I ask what the words were?
Oh, yes. So on our quilt, please shows up a few different times. Please, man, I can't breathe. And just get up.
Hard.
Yeah, I can't move. And
did yours say mama?
Is mama.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, mama is at the bottom of the quilt. It has 9 or 10 lines of lettering, and I actually said that I was willing to take one of the quilts that had more words or more lettering, because I felt like I had the skill and with the youth help had the skill and the maybe the resources to be able to do a quilt that had more word content. I
Kathy,
will
can I
say,
ask you
Kathy,
about the
the back of Kathy's quilt is really important too.
so we were given sort of a template of how we were to do these quilts, and I followed the rules more or less, and that
Uh,
was black background and a certain color scheme on this quilt, and my color scheme was sort of orange to yellow lettering, but on the back I used some of the border that I created to make a cross um, on the back of the quilt, and I felt that that was really an important piece. And I guess if I were going to be doing it again, and what I've learned from Harriet, I wouldn't have followed the rules, and I would have maybe used, used my own instinct to actually include the cross on the front of the quilt along with the lettering.
I'm wondering if you can talk to me about just the emotional or spiritual impact of this. You weren't just lettering a wise saying from a sage of the past. You were these are George Floyd's personal responses, his pleas, and the dying requests of a man.
Yeah.
And
Can I? Oh,
but I would like to know from you, Kathy, just what you felt with connecting the immediacy of that event and those words.
Kathy,
Yeah.
can you speak up? I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. I'll try to speak up. Yes. First of all, the quilting experience during the summer of 2020 was quite isolating. You know, generally, I think about quilting with others most of the time, whether it's a habitat quilt or with my quilt guild. So it was quite an isolating time. And we only had a couple of months to get these quilts completed. We hoped to have them done by September. So, you know, we were working June, July, August. I One of the things that I found myself doing was wanting to read and learn more about the issues around racial injustices in our country's history, and um, learning just more so that I could understand what I was hearing in the news, and um, trying to put that together. And the thing that I don't know that it happened during the summer, but it happened as we all gathered to bless the quilts at the Cathedral of the Pines. Then I really felt like I was part of this group of people who wanted to have some kind of a relationship in being allies, and I don't think we knew what that really even meant, and but it was powerful to be at the top of this mountain, or yeah, small hill, whatever, and seeing all the quilts together. We had some Zoom meetings, but that still felt very kind of isolating, and I didn't really get to know
Right.
people. But after we had blessed the quilts, and Mark and Harriet said, you know, I think we need to continue this ministry some way, and invited people to participate in that, continuing whatever it was going to be. And I said, yes, that's where the relationship, developing really authentic relationships with Mark and Harriet, made a huge impact on me. And I think, you know, if there's any, you know, transformation, that was for me developing relationships with people I didn't know before this whole project, and yet who are very important to me, and we have a shared mission, and you know, we have our squabbles and our disagreements, but we understand, you know, that we're really trying to work together to bring this ministry along, and help people to think about, talk about the hard things. And, you know, what about anti-racism? Can they do to help, um, you know, um, change the world, change how we each respond.
Thank you, Kathy. Mark, I wonder if I could ask you two questions. One is, tell me about the moment when all those quilts are finally in one place after those 9 different churches have been working on them. And then I heard a phrase that you said in the documentary that I watched. It said, "We lived with those words for so long." So first seeing them assembled, and if you'd comment on living with those words.
Right. Thank you so much. So I'm glad that you've picked up on
Mark,
Hold on.
hang on just 1 second.
We're not hearing you.
We're not hearing you.
that. Hello?
Try again.
Hello? Hello? I wonder why.
Nope.
Huh.
Oh, Mark.
We've heard Mark before, so I don't know what has changed.
Give us just 1 second. We're seeing you.
Do you want me to get off and come back on?
Because I don't know what changed.
Steve,
Yes, Harriet.
I know you said you're editing, but I forgot to say something. Kathy reminded me of it.
Go ahead and
You
say
asked
it,
me
and
which-
we'll cut it in
You asked me
later.
which quilt. I also made quilt 3, which is the flag of Ghana. And I did that by myself. And it sort of morphs into what you're asking Mark. Those words have lived with us for so long that the reason I chose the flag of Ghana was because that was the place where the ancestors were first ripped out of their land and their homes.
Mm-hmm.
And they said the same words. And so I quilted those words onto the flag of Ghana. So that's quilt 3. I forgot about it. When Kathy was thinking of all the words, and Mark says, yeah, we've lived with them forever.
It could be anywhere, but in particular in Chicago, if you happen to have people's reactions or conversations that began.
So the quilts in the last year, the quilts have been to, almost, I can't remember. It's like almost 90 places or something like that. They've been all over the country. And one of the things that we found is, and Harriet can speak to this too in a really powerful way. One of the things that we found is that originally when we sent out the quilts, we insisted that we had to be with them, at every venue. And then recently we've kind of said, okay, we'll let them go a little bit, see what happens, and they act as a kind of a very, very interesting kind of liturgical and provocation in a lot of churches, and they do really amazing things at many, many different places. Do you want to talk about that, Harriet?
Sure. Yeah, I felt really proprietary about them and protective of them. I mean, even handing my quilts over to Mark for the first time, I felt like I was giving away children to a stranger. And what are you going to do with my quilt? And then when this whole installation came together, the first time they left us where we couldn't be right there with them, I think they went to Ohio, which is really far away. And I was really worried about the care they get. But I was also thinking, no one's going to know what to say about these quilts. We were involved in the quilts. We're more important. We need to be there. We need to talk about the quilts. And then it flipped on me. No, the quilts are doing the talking, and people are responding to the quilts. It's not me talking about the quilts. It's not me docening the quilts or guiding people in their experience with the quilts. It's letting people and churches respond to the quilts. And so when I step back and listen to the responses, I've been really blown away. And I've learned so much. I mean, and people are so inspired. I listened to a group of people in Massachusetts, and there was a pastor who I know and adore, But there was a pastor who did this wonderful meditation, and then there were people who got up and talked, well, a woman who specifically got up and talked about how she was going to go into the Framingham Women's Prison, which is the oldest women's prison in the country, and work on quilt projects in the prison. The quilt spoke to them. We didn't come up with that. And so when we sit back and let it go, it's the quilts that do the work. So when I was at the Parliament, I was just sitting there in my chair and people would come by. They didn't know who I was. And I'd kind of roll up and say, how are you feeling? And that was the question. And I got all kinds of responses, but one that was really, really common, which is something that Mark and I hit on a lot, and Kathy, is that these quilts are challenging. A quilt is a comforting icon, but these quilts also challenge you. And the juxtaposition of the challenge and the comfort is where the stress comes. People would say pain and beauty. It's the same thing. And I heard that as a common response. And then I started to see it in the faces of people. I didn't even have to speak to them. I could see people walk through and just sort of stop. And I just got off on watching where they stopped and what they were looking at. And maybe try to imagine what they were thinking, because I realized that if I interrupted what they were thinking, I was interrupting. So
interesting what you point out there about, we even call quilts comforters.
Yeah. Yes, we do, don't we?
Yeah.
But these are comforter pain inducers.
Yeah. So the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry, is there something in the future or future goals? When you first talked, Mark, you had the AIDS quilt come to your mind, which of course covered hundreds and hundreds of feet when all of its various parts were assembled. And I'm just wondering what you see in the future for this.
Mark has great visions of the future.
Well, it's not just me; it's all of us. You know, we've had lots of ideas, and I think that one of the things that we're hoping to do now is we're hoping to kind of the growing edge for the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry. I think is to try and engage more churches and more institutions in the actual process of actually making quilts and confronting racism in this way, because I think that we've kind of stumbled upon a pretty remarkable mode of kind of getting into this difficult conversation that a lot of particularly white people are very reticent to get into into the conversation around race.
Right.
I like to call it I like to call it kind of a rhetorical sleight of hand in a sense, and it has to do with this comfort challenge thing that we were just speaking of, in the sense that, you know, when people come to see the quilts, they think that, you know, a quilt as we have just said is a comforter, and it's something, and so when they move through the exhibit, then something shifts for them, right? There's this moment when the recognition is that what's really going on here is about challenge as well as about comfort, and that, but what this does is it creates this opportunity and a context for conversation in this really quite remarkable way, because of the prayerfulness and the kind of intentionality of the creation of the quilts. So another phrase that I like to use is multiple opportunities for transformation. We have this opportunity for transformation that comes with just viewing the quilts and having conversations about them, but really the kind of the hoped for really kind of most intense form of transformation comes from actually making a quilt, because it's such an expression of intention. and shared purpose, right? When you have intention and shared purpose that culminates in a symbolically resonant thing, object, then you have something that is really quite powerful that you can point to in your church, and you can say, we made this together, and this is something that we learned from that process.
I
So Mark has come up with a couple other amazing thoughts on the future that he didn't reference, and I really want to. One is Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Legacy Museum in Alabama has those 4,000 coffins, right? And he has exonerated 135 people who were wrongfully on death row. And I have this dream that in engaging those churches as they make quilts, as Mark was talking about, that maybe to come into relationship. I really believe that a core to dismantling racism has to do with relationships, building authentic relationships, right? So what if in these churches they're making a quilt, if they were actually in relationship with one of those people who have been exonerated by Brian Stevenson, so it's a living quilt about their life with someone they're really involved with, making friendships, learning, expanding your cultural awareness, deepening your faith, creating relationships while making the quilt, instead of making a quilt that's on someone's dying words who's never met. So that's 135. And the other one was the idea of 5,000 people, both black and white, because if a white person stood up for a black person, they could have been lynched, right? Nigger lovers. Mm-hmm. So 5,000 quilts to represent the 5,000 people who have been lynched since the late 1800s when Judge Lynch said lynching was okay. What about a project of 5,000? So not just engaging the quilt. The church could certainly say, we want to do this and this is how. But I was wondering if those two things might be an inspiration and a way to get started. It's the getting started of it that's the hardest part, I think.
Kathy, I know you need to leave in just a minute, so maybe I will start here with sort of some final questions, which was to ask you, as you think about being involved in these quilts with the last words of George Floyd, how has God surprised you in how this became a ministry, or did something change in your relationship? I'm just asking how you see God working in that.
Well, I personally think that God is all about love. And so for me, I made authentic relationships with Mark and Harriet and have come to love those two people that we work so closely together. But I also think that other people have been able to draw nearer to God and one another in experiencing the quilts. And I'll tell you, the youth group at my church witnessed the quilts and saw the documentary on Martin Luther King Day in this past year, in 2023. And the youth leaders said to the young people after walking around the whole display of them, show me or stand next to the quilt that speaks to you. And these dozen or more youth kind of wandered throughout the quilts and then settled next to one each. And some of them, there might have been two youth that had quilt. And then she asked them, and tell me why you chose the one you did. and the responses from these young teenagers was so profound. And I just, I was so moved by that experience, and see so much hope in the future with young people like this who can be moved and who are able to articulate what it is they're thinking and feeling. And so, I see hope in these relationships and the future of the church, and I guess that's been really important in my experience working with this whole ministry.
Thank you. That's really powerful to see those young people having that sense of empathy being awakened by that. How about you, Dr. Ward? How has God surprised you in this ministry or this project?
Oh my. Every day. Well, as your producer Heather had mentioned in an email that, you see New Hampshire as the frozen white north. There's been some thawing. As I look at Kathy, for example, as a sister, and I look at as white, I just look at Kathy as not black. That's a big change in me. And that's from being, like a prayerful, focused place with her when you're making a quilt together. And that's a surprise for me because I pretty much keep to myself. Same thing with Mark. I mean, why would I engage with this guy? And now it's like, how could I not? And God surprised me that way because I couldn't know that I could sort of bring people into my life. I was very, during the ministry, during the project, like I was the only black person. And there was the isolation of COVID, but I felt very isolated. But I am not isolated now. That isolation, that feeling of isolation is gone, and I feel some real purpose and like I can do it. And it can only get better, right? And that's a surprise to me. Also, that I can give up that whole proprietary thing in me that says I have to do it. No one else will understand it. I won't be able to communicate it. And I'm learning that, yes, I can. I feel like my faith has deepened. Not so much just because of the quilt, but because of the relationship that I have been gifted, that came out of the quilt. And that gift is Mark and Kathy. And God surprised me by giving them to me. I don't know if God gave them to me, but by sort of this is creation. Me and Mark and Kathy, we're part of creation. And I'm just surprised at that because I'd just be, sitting in my house, sewing my stuff by myself. Kathy said that she saw quilting as a community thing. I always saw quilting as a loner thing. So that's a surprise.
Nicely stated.
There are so many more, but I don't know where to start. And I've been described as a scientist, and I am, but I don't need to be that anymore. I don't want to be that. I just want to sort of think through where the Spirit is pushing me and listen to it. The Ruach.
Mark, I think of things like the scriptural image of the teeny mustard seed being so small, but that much faith, and yet it grows large enough that the birds can come and lodge, the words of Jesus. But this seems like one of those projects where this little mustard seed surprised everybody by what it grew into. How have you seen God working in this?
Thank you for saying that. I do agree with that. one of the things that Harriet often says is that she, we'll be sitting somewhere in like some hotel room in Chicago or something like that, and we'll be kind of thinking, how on earth did we get here, and Harriet will say something like, well, this all started with one 2-inch square of fabric, and and it's really true, that
Oh my God, the fabric's the mustard seed.
yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
There's this quality, right, in which, and this is something that Harriet and I kind of came upon fairly early on too, is this idea that anytime you have fragments, a collection of fragments, you have the possibility of a narrative, right? And so this relationship between fragment and narrative is something that is deeply ingrained not only in us as storytellers, as human beings, but also as followers of Christ, right? That we all we've been given these 4 gospels that have these little stories about our Savior, and we each week we have a little fragment that we think about, and we try and kind of spur our moral imagination around. So it's I think that it's something that is continually surprising, this way in which the fabric of our lives is meaningfully symbolized and spoken about through this mode of narrative storytelling through fabric. It's just kind of amazing, really. And so that's what I'm continually surprised by how the texture of fabric is so symbolic and so meaningful and so compelling to so many people. We had a Zoom call in which we asked people to just go and, they were all in their homes, right? So we asked them to go and get a piece of fabric and bring it and tell us the story of the piece of fabric. And each of those people, there were like 20 of them, and they came with these incredible stories with these little pieces of fabric that they had. And, and I too, I have fabric that, my late father, wore, and it means so much to me, we imbue so much meaning into our the fabric of our lives.
Yeah. I think as Harriet, Dr. Ward was talking about meeting you and also meeting Kathy, that sounds like a few squares sort of being sewed together, joined together in a way, and I just sort of see the whole, as it calls the body of Christ, and every part. A quilt is just a different image of that same joining together. But it takes work. So I am so pleased that we have gotten to hear from all 3 of you, Reverend Mark Koyama, Kathy Barrett Blair, and Dr. Harriet Ward, with the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry. As we emphasize that this is not a thing that has an end. This is an ongoing project, and the seriousness and the gravity of those final words of an actual human being, of George Floyd as he died, becoming representative, as Harriet said, of really centuries of I can't breathe. I think you're doing a wonderful ministry, and I'm sure you are in many other ways, but we are so pleased and inspired to hear about what you're doing in this ministry. Thank you all for speaking with me today in good faith.